Has you ever stopped to think if, maybe, a legal slip-up by the prosecution, even in a really serious drug case, could actually end up shielding someone from facing the original, heavier charges? It sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? But today we're going to dig into a fascinating Supreme Court case from right here in the Philippines that explores exactly that. It's all about the tricky balance between plea bargaining rules, how diligent prosecutors need to be, and that fundamental right against double jeopardy. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to unpack the complex stuff and give you the core insights. Today, our focus is squarely on a recent, pretty heavily discussed Supreme Court decision. It really gets into the weeds of plea bargaining in drug cases and its big principle, double jeopardy. Our main source is the ultimate one, the Supreme Court's own decision. It's Vicente Suarez Jr. y Banua petitioner versus People of the Philippines respondent. The specific case number is GR Num 268672, and it was handed down or promulgated on December 4, 2023. So our mission today is pretty clear. Break down the facts, see how this case moved through the courts, really understand the key legal questions the Supreme Court tackled, and reveal what this final ruling actually means for justice and legal procedures here. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. So first up, let's talk about the petitioner, Vicente Suarez Jr. y Banua. He was facing a very serious charge. We're talking about a violation of Article 2, Section 5 of Republic Act 9165. That's the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002. The allegation was that back on March 20th, 2019, over in Tabaco City, Albay, he sold drugs. Specifically, 2.1585 grams of methamphetamine hydrochloride, or shabu.
Okay, 2.1585 grams. That specific number sounds like it might become important later. And the formal charge, the information, that came a bit later, May 27, 2019.
That's right. And when he was first arraigned, brought before the court on September 21st, 2019, he pleaded not guilty. Straight up denied the sale charge.
So initially, he's fighting the main charge head on. But then things shifted, didn't they? What happened next?
They did. Fast forward almost a year to August 3, 2020. Suarez filed a motion, a significant one. He basically proposed, hey, I want to plead guilty, but not to the original selling charge. He wanted to plead guilty to a lesser offense, specifically Article 2, Section 12 of the same law. That section deals with possessing drug paraphernalia, equipment, apparatus, that kind of thing. A much, much less serious charge than Section 5, the sale.
Right. Selling versus just possessing paraphernalia. Those carry very different penalties, I imagine. So how did the prosecution react to this offer? I can't imagine they were thrilled.
Not at all. They strongly opposed it. They argued, look, we have enough evidence to prove the original Section 5 charge, the sale. We think we can convict him on that. And they also stressed a point they felt was crucial. For plea bargaining under the drugs law, RA 9165, you need the approval from both the public prosecutor and the arresting officers. They insisted that was a requirement.
Okay, so the prosecution draws a line in the sand. We have the evidence for the big charge, and we haven't consented to this lesser plea.
Right.
What did the trial court, the RTC, do with that?
Well, this is where it takes a bit of a turn. Branch 15 of the regional trial court in Tabaco City, Albay, actually granted Suarez's motion. This was on September 14th, 2020. So despite the prosecution's very clear objections, the court allowed the plea to the lesser offense.
Wow. Okay, so the judge basically overruled the prosecution on this.
It seems so. Suarez was then rearraigned, this time for the Section 12 charge, possession of paraphernalia. And with his lawyer there, he pleaded guilty to that lesser charge.
So he pleads guilty to Section 12. Then what? Did the court sentence him right away?
Pretty quickly after that. The RTC handed down its formal decision on October 1st, 2020. Suarez was convicted for violating Section 12, the paraphernalia charge. He received an indeterminate sentence, meaning a range of 2 years up to 4 years, plus a fine of 10,000 pesos. The court also laid out conditions for his probation, things like going through a risk assessment program, supporting anti-drug campaigns, staying out of trouble.
So from Suarez's perspective, at that moment, it probably felt like the case was resolved, albeit with a conviction and probation for a lesser crime. But the prosecution wasn't giving up, were they?
Definitely not. They filed a motion for reconsideration with the RTC, basically asking the judge to rethink the decision, again, highlighting their lack of consent. But the RTC wasn't persuaded. They denied that motion on November 17th, 2020.
All right, so the RTC doubles down. What's the prosecution's next move? They can't just let it go, right?
Exactly. They took the fight to the next level, the Court of Appeals. They filed what's called a petition for certiorari. Essentially, they were asking the higher court, the CA, to step in and say, the RTC messed up badly, committed a grave abuse of discretion, is the legal term. Their argument was still centered on that lack of consent, arguing the plea bargain shouldn't have been allowed without it. They wanted the CA to scrap the RTC's decision and send the case back down for a full trial on the original Section 5 charge.
So they're really pushing to get back to that initial serious charge of selling drugs? How did the Court of Appeals see it?
The Court of Appeals, they actually agreed with the prosecution. In a decision dated October 27, 2022, the CA granted the prosecution's petition. They nullified the RTC's rulings, the conviction, the probation, all of it, wiped it clean. And, crucially, they ordered the case remanded sent back to the RTC to continue the trial on the original Section 5 charge. Back to square one, essentially, for Suarez regarding the selling charge.
Okay, that's a huge reversal. What was the CA's main reasoning for siding so strongly with the prosecution?
Their reasoning was pretty direct. They held that the prosecutor's consent is, like the prosecution argued, a condition sine qua non, an absolute must-have requirement for a valid plea to a lesser offense in these cases. Since that consent was missing, the CA said, Suarez's guilty plea to the Section 12 charge was invalid, fundamentally flawed, and if the plea is invalid, they reasoned, it couldn't trigger double jeopardy. It didn't count as a valid termination of the case that would prevent another prosecution for the original, more serious charge.
So the CA is saying no consent, no valid plea, no double jeopardy protection. That makes sense on the surface. Did Suarez just accept that?
No, he didn't. He filed a motion asking the CA to reconsider its decision, but that was denied too on July 11th, 2023. So that left him really only one place to go.
The Supreme Court, the final arbiter.
Precisely. Suarez filed a petition with the Supreme Court challenging the CA's ruling. He brought forward two main arguments. First, he insisted that, the trial court does have some discretion in plea bargaining, even if the prosecutor objects. And second, probably his most powerful argument, was double jeopardy. He argued that trying him again on the Section 5 charge, after he'd already been convicted and sentenced for the Section 12 charge by the RTC, would violate his constitutional right against being tried twice for the same thing.
Okay, so the stage is set for the Supreme Court. You have the CA saying the plea was invalid due to lack of consent, meaning no double jeopardy. And you have Suarez saying, hold on, I was already convicted, the case was terminated, double jeopardy applies. How did the High Court rule? This is the core of our deep dive today.
Absolutely. And the Supreme Court's decision in Vicente Suarez Jr., I. Banua versus People, GR number 268672, dated December 4th, 2023. Well, that's quite something. The court partly granted Suarez's petition, so not a total win on every single point, he argued, perhaps, but, and this is the kicker, it reversed the Court of Appeals decision, it overturned what the CA had ordered, and the final line was definitive. Criminal case no, T7583 was declared closed and terminated.
Whoa, okay, hang on. Closed and terminated. So the Supreme Court basically said, nope, he's not going back to trial on that Section 5 charge.
Yeah.
How did they get there, especially when the CA seems so clear on the consent issue? What does the Supreme Court focus on?
Right, it's a bit of a twist. The Supreme Court looked beyond just the consent issue. They brought in their own established guidelines, specifically from a 2022 case called People v. Monteiro, and they pointed to a very specific part, guideline number 6 in Monteiro. This guideline directly references something called the plea bargaining framework in drugs cases. This is a set of rules the Supreme Court itself issued back in 2018.
Okay, a framework specifically for drug cases.
Exactly. And this framework has a crystal clear rule for cases involving the sale of shabu, Section 5, if the quantity is 1.00 gram or more.
Which Suarez's case was, right? It was over 2 grams.
Precisely, 2.1585 grams. The framework says for quantities of 1.00 gram and above of shabu in a Section 5 sale case, no plea bargaining is allowed, full stop.
Wait a minute. So the Supreme Court is saying that based on their own rules, the RTC shouldn't have even considered the plea bargain in the first place, regardless of consent, just based on the amount of drugs involved.
That's exactly it. The RTC made a fundamental error right at the outset by even entertaining, let alone granting, a plea bargain that was explicitly prohibited by the Supreme Court's own framework for that quantity of shabu.
That seems like a massive error by the trial court. So why didn't that just automatically mean the CA was right to send it back if the whole plea bargain was improper from the start?
But here's the crucial procedural nuance. And this is really the heart of the Supreme Court's reasoning. The Supreme Court meticulously noted that while the prosecution did object to the plea bargain, they never raised the specific reason for their objection. Their objection was entirely focused on the lack of their consent. They didn't argue, hey, judge, you can't allow this plea bargain anyway because the quantity is over 1 gram, which violates the SC's framework.
So, wait, the RTC messed up by allowing a prohibited plea, but the prosecution also messed up by objecting for the wrong reason. They objected based on consent, not based on the quantity rule from the framework.
You've got it. The prosecution had the correct legal basis available to them, the framework prohibiting the plea based on quantity, but they didn't use it. They relied solely on the consent argument.
That's fascinating. So what does the law say happens when you have the right argument, but you don't make it?
The Supreme Court invoked a legal principle called waiver of procedural infirmities. They even cited another case, Villa-Gomez v. People. Basically, the idea is if there's a procedural error or a specific legal ground you could object on, you have to raise it properly and at the right time. If you don't, you might be considered to have waived that objection. You lose the chance to rely on it later. So the prosecution's failure to specifically flag the quantity issue as the reason the plea was impermissible under the framework was deemed a waiver of that particular argument.
Okay, my head is spinning slightly. So the plea was technically improper due to quantity, but the prosecution waived their right to argue that specific point by focusing only on consent. How does this then connect back to Suarez's main defense, the double jeopardy argument?
It connects directly and decisively. Because the prosecution waived the correct objection, the quantity framework violation, the Supreme Court then looked at whether the requirements for double jeopardy had been met based on what actually happened and wasn't properly challenged, and the court found, yes, all the elements were there. 1. Suarez was indicted under a valid information, check. 2. The RTC had jurisdiction over him and the offense, check. 3. He was rearraigned for the lesser offense, section 12, after the RTC granted his motion and he entered a guilty plea, check. And 4. The case was terminated by his conviction for that lesser offense, and importantly, that RTC judgment had become final and executory. The time for appeals on that specific conviction had run out without a valid, timely challenge on the correct grounds being sustained.
So let me try to put this together. Even though the RTC's initial decision to allow the plea was wrong based on the quantity rule in the SEC framework, because the prosecution didn't raise that specific error correctly, and because Suarez was subsequently convicted on the lesser charge and that conviction became final, his protection against double jeopardy kicked in.
That's precisely the conclusion the Supreme Court reached. Despite the RTC's initial error, the combination of the prosecution's waiver of the correct objection and the finality of the judgment on the lesser offense meant Suarez's constitutional right against double jeopardy had to be upheld. The attempt by the prosecution to revive the original Section 5 charge via the CA appeal came too late and was based on an argument, lack of consent, that, while relevant, didn't override the fact that the judgment based on the procedurally flawed but unchallenged on the right grounds plea had become final.
Wow. So the prosecution's procedural misstep in how they objected ultimately shielded Suarez from facing the original, more serious charge. The finality of that flawed RTC decision became paramount because the flaw wasn't challenged correctly.
Exactly. It really underscores how critical procedural rules and timely, specific objections are in the legal system. A mistake by the court might have occurred, but a failure by the opposing party to point out that mistake using the correct legal reasoning can have irreversible consequences, especially when fundamental rights like double jeopardy are involved. The case was, as the SC declared, closed and terminated.
This case is just, well, it's a masterclass in procedural intricacies, isn't it? It really drives home how one detail, one specific argument not made can completely alter the outcome. It makes you wonder, what does this tell us about just how vital precision is in legal arguments?
Yeah.
And maybe how might this ruling influence future drug cases or plea bargaining strategies here in the Philippines? We genuinely love to hear what you think. Drop your comments below what part of this case stood out most to you. And hey, if you found this deep dive insightful, please hit that favorite button.
Absolutely. And just to quickly recap the key legal doctrines we've unpacked from this Suarez decision. First, plea bargaining in drug cases. Remember, it's allowed sometimes, but the Supreme Court's framework is strict. For selling shabu, Section 5, if it's 1.00 gram or more, the framework says no plea bargaining, period. That was the rule the RTC initially missed.
Got it. No plea bargain over 1 gram for Section 5 shabu sale. What's next?
Second, prosecution's consent versus court's discretion. Okay, so prosecutor's consent is important. The SC acknowledges that. But ultimately, the trial court does have discretion. However, and this is key, the court must properly consider and rule on valid objections. Objections like the evidence is strong or the accused is a repeat offender, or, crucially, this plea violates the SC framework.
Right, so the court has power, but it has to listen to the right arguments when they're made correctly.
Third, double jeopardy. This is that bedrock constitutional right. You can't be tried or punished twice for the same offense. Once you've gone through a valid process charged, pleaded in a court with jurisdiction, and the case ends in conviction or acquittal, that protection usually locks in.
And that's what ultimately protected Suarez here, despite the initial mess-up.
Yes, leading to the final point. Fourth, waiver of procedural infirmities. This is the idea that if you don't raise a specific legal issue or procedural mistake at the right time and in the right way, you lose your chance to rely on it. You've waived it. And that's exactly what happened with the prosecution's failure to object based on the drug quantity violating the framework. That waiver was critical.
It really feels like a powerful lesson in legal strategy and just how strictly the rules, including the rules about making arguments, are applied. A truly fascinating case. Don't miss out on more deep dives like this one, where we unpack the complex issues shaping our legal landscape and more. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and you'll be all set for our next insightful discussion.